When dealing with a falsehood, you're faced with two options. You can accept it or you can reject it. The basis upon which we take one of these actions is a product of our critical thinking capabilities and a desire to know what is true instead of confirming our bias. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. On Brainstorm, we choose the hard truths over the comforting lies. Reason, compassion, skepticism. This is the Brainstorm podcast.
Hi folks, welcome to the Brainstorm podcast Skeptic Studio, the interview portion of the Brainstorm podcast, where we talk to a variety of folks with the intent to spread critical thinking, compassion, and skepticism. In this interview, I talked to the one and only Peter Coffin. Peter is one of my favorite YouTubers and always produces quality content with thought-provoking messages. In Peter's content, they have a tendency to analyze things through a Marxist lens, but also using various ideas from postmodern philosophy. I wanted to talk to them about how that works, if that works, and why many people think that doesn't work. What you get is, in this conversation, is the result of that. Peter does some philosophy, and I try to help. Remember that if you want to contact us about the show, then you can do that by emailing us at mail@brainstormblog.net, and if you want to support the show, then you can do that at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast. And with that, I'm going to send you over to the interview after this message from another podcast.
I know we shouldn't have to scream that we're atheists. You know, we don't have non-astrologers and all that. But with the religious people taking over the world, I mean, we can either speak up or be pushed into a corner. I'm proud to be an atheist.
What happens when you're an atheist living in the Canadian Bible Belt? If you're like me, you gather some friends and you take to the airwaves. So I invite you to come and join us every week to take a left to the valley and find out where you stand in this world. Follow us on iTunes, YouTube, Spreaker, Blog Talk Radio, or SoundCloud, or lefttothevalley.com. Atheist, skeptic, and humanist radio, no God required.
Faith in God is like a virus, so why would I respect it? The line between good and evil gets blurred once infected. The truth you neglected.
So I guess, welcome back to the Skeptic Studio. Today I'm talking to Peter Coffin again. This is the third time I've interviewed you.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure all I've ever caused is more nonsense. So
yeah. People are going to have to start wondering why I keep having the same people on. I recently talked to Aaron Rabbi from Embrace the Void and Philosophers in Space.
Oh yeah, I like him.
Yeah, he's a good guy. That's the third time I've had him on as well. So
oh, cool.
Yeah,
I did Embrace the Void maybe a month or two ago.
Yeah, listen to those episodes.
I like them. They're great guys.
Yeah, for sure. I keep thinking I should talk to GW on his own someday, because I always talk to Aaron and I feel like I'm leaving out the other guy. It's not fair.
Well, I think that they both have very interesting perspective. They're different. They're very different from each other, and I thought that was. I wasn't always. When I go on to podcasts with multiple people, I don't always expect that, so that was cool.
Yeah, it's nice to have multiple angles you can discuss, but I guess okay. So we're going to talk about postmodernism and Marxism because they're kind of incompatible, according to what I've been told.
Oh yeah, people do not look at these things as compatible at all. I mean, look. So Marxism is, to just start off, it's inherently modern, and postmodernism people view as like an exclusive, like, okay, we're moving on from modernism. That's it. That type of stuff. It's done. There's no more evidence. There's no more anything. It's just all perspective. That's what postmodernism is, and. That's not true.
The truth is somewhere in there.
Yeah. I mean, well, and I'm not going to say like these things are fundamentally compatible either. That's something that's important to acknowledge. They are very different.
Right.
Marxism is a very different perspective from, and a lot of people who were postmodern philosophers or took part in philosophy during the postmodern era, depending on, there's some interesting distinctions that can be made there, but still,
yeah,
a lot of those people were Marxists or started as Marxists. Foucault wasn't necessarily like a full-blown Marxist, but like he was very active in circles that were Marxist. And I don't think that stuff is really talked about as much. And I'm not going to say that he was specifically a Marxist either, because he wasn't. And I think that his critique of Marxism, or rather, I guess what would be more adjacent to Marxism at times, he was active in a lot of revolutionary action. He was actually active. And I use Foucault because that's the person they talk about the most. But I think there's also more people who said things that I think are more relevant to our lives now than Foucault.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's also something. Like, they tend not to put Debord in with postmodernism because Debord was very, very specifically Marxist, but he also talked a lot about abstract things and about perspective and about how the actual, viewpoint of people, the actual worldview becomes a material object in a sense and is commodified and is also acting on behalf of the power structure. And that doesn't sound like Marxism. I mean, you use like the word commodified or commodity, and that relates to Marxism. But I mean, that stuff, it's stuff that if you were talking in a discussion with people who talk exclusively about postmodernism, I think you would be at home discussing. I don't think anybody would be like, what are you talking about with your materialist crap here? Because the idea that a worldview can be an object is both an abstract and a materialist view. And I think that that's something... I think that, for me, he's kind of the bridge between these viewpoints. And I think that there are places where what Debord said can be applied all over the place in postmodern thought. And if we take postmodern thought and sort of apply it to the idea that human perspective is more a thing that we deal with, a thing that we see things through, a lens, so to speak, to use more postmodern stuff.
Right.
And then understand that outside of human perspective, there is a material world that doesn't care about our terms, doesn't care about our concepts, doesn't think, doesn't do any of that stuff. It's just a collection of systems that do things without our input.
Right.
And therefore, the lines are very blurry, my friend.
Yeah.
If you want to get into it.
Yeah, well, I kind of do. Well, I guess so. I like to look at the basics first, right? Like,
yes.
So, what is postmodernism? Like, where does that line start in the first place?
Well, that's something that we could talk for 40 minutes or more about on its own. Because postmodernism, like, when I explain it, I tend to simplify a lot because I tend to find that if you actually go into the details to what, like, you have to start by explaining that the Enlightenment, you start there, and really you could go further back, but the Enlightenment caused a certain set of beliefs. That certain set of beliefs was criticized. That created modernism. And that created a certain set of beliefs which were criticized, which created postmodernism. And again, like I said, I'm simplifying even here. I'm simplifying the explanation.
Right.
But, so postmodernism isn't a thing. It's not like there's not like, here's rule 1 for postmodernism. Here's rule 2. Like it's not a set of criteria. And I think that that's something a lot of people want it to be.
Yeah. Yeah. When they argue against it, they sure seem to be arguing against a thing, right?
But I think even some people who are proponents of it want it to be a set of principles, and it's not, because it's essentially I mean, you can say postmodernism as in an area of thought. You can say postmodernism as in an era of thought. I mean, you can't really say postmodernism is Foucault's philosophy. Postmodernism is Baudrillard's philosophy, or Baudrillard. I don't know how to say it. I'm not French.
Fair.
But I've read both of those people, and I could tell you that both of them have massively different viewpoints of the world, like simulacra and simulation. Whichever order of those is correct, is a book that more or less tells us about the creation of imitations of something that never existed, which then again relates to both Debord and therefore can be related to Marxism, but also doesn't relate to those things. It can also be a exclusively abstract viewpoint. So, I mean, you're talking about something that's very messy. Like, people who are considered postmodern are not affiliated. They're not affiliated with each other. They're not a movement of any kind. They're not. It's more just a sort of a blanket term to talk about an era or an area of people. Yeah,
like I know I've heard, I have a friend who's a pretty, I don't know, he went to school for philosophy for a long time. Mm-hmm. and he thinks of like Derrida as postmodernist.
Derrida came up with deconstruction. Like, that's essentially a process he created, which is, I engage in the like exact, like, I use his process as is. I don't typically mess with what he put forward as quote unquote deconstruction. And for a lot of people, postmodernism means deconstruction, but I would argue that that's not what it means. And I bet your friend would agree.
Right. Yeah. It just happens to be one person's, like, deconstruction is almost a philosophy on its own that you have to examine, type of thing.
Yes. I very much like the idea of deconstruction is to reduce something to its most fundamental parts and examine them for context, for relations, for and the thing is, again, this is where I feel this is actually more materialist than people really give it credit for, because even an abstract idea, when reduced to its fundamental parts, is very hard to act as though there aren't. If there are fundamental parts to something, it is kind of a material, an object in of itself. But I mean, then when we start talking about perspective, we take those fundamental parts and look at them through different lenses, and that's, I mean, I get frustrated because this is the specific spot where I think people don't understand that materialism and thinking about perspective and abstract and lenses and different human conditions are not, they're not mutually exclusive. One can be a criticism of the other, and one can kind of be a sort of even a reactionary force towards that criticism. But I don't think that it makes sense to draw all these distinctions between these things as if they're two sides to, like, I'm rooting for postmodernism, everybody. That's the one I think should win. I don't think it's one of them is criticism of the other, and not directly even of Marxism, just of modernism.
Right.
Which Marxism can pretty easily fit into, but I would say there's even parts of that are exclusively about social relationships as opposed to actual materials. And there is a material history to social relationships, but it's also one that can only be relayed and interpreted by people, and therefore it is not a pure object. So, I mean, that's the problem. I mean, this is, in my opinion, the fundamental conflict between these two types of things. People want it to be one or the other, and it's not. It can't be, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, it almost sounds like there's, I don't know, it almost wraps itself around itself in a way. Like,
that's what I think you object. Get your aurora or your I forgot the word, but the snake eating itself.
Oh yeah, that's right. That I don't know the name of it, but yeah, it's kind of like that.
In my opinion, that's kind of, I mean, in some ways that's just philosophy in general, but if you want to like sort of put modernism and postmodernism into one thing, that's it. Like, modernism is very oriented towards the idea that there is a final truth that can be found, and I don't know if that's possible, but at the same time, I don't know that it's healthy to just constantly dwell in the idea that there is no final truth. I think this is sort of my vague contribution that people have come forward to me and told me, you need to look into meta-modernism, and I've ultimately found that I very much agree with that idea.
Okay.
But to me, there needs to be a collective or shared experience / reality, and that has to be evidence-based. It has to be democratic and accepted, and if it's not based in those things, it's not really. You could say that various organized religions throughout history have been shared realities, but then when scrutiny comes, they sort of fall apart.
Right.
So, like, the issue is, I think, personally, that we haven't found a shared reality that can withstand criticism.
Right.
Because postmodernism is ultimately kind of that. Modernism is like a sort of putting, and I'm, again, vastly oversimplifying here,
right.
Putting forward of this is the world, this is how it is. We used science to get here, and science is great. That's, like I said, my idea is that things do have to be evidence-based, but science can get things wrong. In fact, like, it's designed to get things wrong until it finds the thing that it can continually do. And when we look at things that way, just saying, like, all right, it's 1950, we've figured it out, that's all, it's not useful. And that's sort of a fetishization of science. And I think that's part of the problem is people have sort of gotten into a viewpoint of where modernism is kind of a fetishization of science. And people get into, like I said early on in this, and I'll probably say again, it's not good to see, like, postmodernism and modernism as sides to take. And I feel like that's a fundamental issue with almost everyone's discussion of this. I see people placing them as, like, combatants in a prize fight. It seems like at times.
That was my thoughts about it, was that, like, often you talk about, I guess, Marxism, and people would say, oh, well, we have to kind of ignore that postmodern garbage and and go, what?
I've seen people call postmodernism neoliberalism.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, like,
and I don't understand how that is true. Like, but I do see those people say postmodernism means the individual has their own reality. And I mean,
right.
If you're taking postmodernism in bad faith, sure, that's fine. Like, neoliberalism is the fetishization of the market, which ultimately results in the atomization of the individual and the atomization of their reality. In my opinion, anyway, my book and all of my content, basically, that's the thing that I'm getting at.
Right.
And that's something I'm personally very critical of. And and I also think that postmodernism is useful. So it seems to me like these things can't possibly be one and the same. Because, I mean, postmodernism, like I said, isn't one thing. And I'm going to try not to repeat that too much. But
I think it's worth repeating. I think because it gets lumped into this particular, and it's almost always in the characterization of individuals get to declare their own reality.
Oh, yes. You know, I mean, that is the most prominent characterization. There's a book, I don't remember the name of the author, in the late 90s that really misrepresented postmodernism. And Philosophy Cuck, I don't know if you've seen his channel.
I've seen it, but I haven't watched much of his stuff.
He did a video on that book and how Jordan Peterson basically derives his full view of postmodernism from that book.
Okay.
And I mean, just saying that, you should be able to understand exactly what the book is, because
right.
we all know what he thinks postmodernism is. And go ahead.
Peterson often conflates postmodernism and quote-unquote cultural Marxism as well, right?
Well, that's the funny thing, is he decides that everything that isn't him is the problem.
Right. All philosophy I don't adhere to is bad.
Which is a result of the atomization of the individual in their reality.
Yeah. Literally the thing he thinks postmodernism is.
Yeah, exactly. He is a very frustrating person as far as postmodernism. And again, I don't claim to be an expert on these things. I've read a lot of it, right. But I'm not going to pretend like I am a postmodern authority or I am a Marxist authority. I'm not, but I do spend a lot of time delving in these ideas. And again, I sort of come from the idea of Debord and the Society of Spectacle. That's sort of my thing. And I feel like that's a bridge of a lot of this, because a lot of what postmodernism, again, to generalize, I'm going to have to say that a billion times. Otherwise, at some point, it will be taken out of context somewhere.
Right.
To generalize is about people's perspective. And the Society of Spectacle is about materially alienating people and atomizing them and giving them intermediate images that are ultimately tools of the power structure that more or less show them the version of the thing they're looking at. Debord asserted it was through screens, but I would even say that it's through the sort of fakeness of communities we've formed now, where people believe, I'm part of a community because I am aware of a bunch of people who like things that I like. That's not a community.
Right.
I mean, the YouTube community is not a community. It is a few people who have seen some degree of success on YouTube talking about a thing. Just not even to talk about like leftist YouTube, just YouTube. It's not a community. And people say like the YouTube community. That's not a community. It's...
Well, and especially with the way that like you can't lump all of YouTube into even one thing, right?
No, and not even close. Like if you said YouTubers, that's a gross like generalization.
Right. Yeah,
like YouTubers are blank. Well, probably some, but I guarantee you there's a lot that aren't.
Yeah.
And you can literally put any word there. And that's the thing that we're sort of talking about ultimately then with perspective, is you have a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives on the materialist account of things. And this is why I think that Marxism isn't utterly incompatible with these sort of postmodern analyses. I don't want to say a postmodern analysis,
right,
but various postmodern analyses. Marxism makes the assumption that you can have an objective history. And if you take away that assumption, which you should, in my opinion, because recorded history is not objective. It never will be. It is subject to the perception and interpretation of the original recorder. It is subject to the perception and interpretation of the person who is reading the account. And if we take that assumption out of Marxism, there's nothing that is really that incompatible, in my opinion. Does that mean we should say that all evidence that is presented is null and void? No, absolutely not. Evidence is actually extremely important in all cases, regardless of perspective of the evidence. Evidence is all we have to go on in the world. We have imperfect perception and interpretation apparatus as human beings. Our memories are very flawed. They rewrite themselves every time we recall a memory. That's an oversimplification, because it's not writing and rewriting, but for best expression of what happens, that's what happens. It's things are complex in a way that I think people who are just like sort of, and in my opinion, that this is sort of both, you can sort of a fetishization of the thing that I believe Marxism. So Marxism is the way things are. I believe postmodernism, which again, you can't really, but I believe in postmodernism. So postmodernism is the way things are. I think these are both fetishizations of the thing, because even Marx, when he discussed social relations, they were all rooted in material things, but social relations, he acknowledged, have perspective in them. He acknowledged the way material conditions affect different people is differently. And that's stuff that it just doesn't seem to be discussed a lot with the type of Marxist that is like, postmodernism is bad.
Right. Yeah, I'm just kind of drawing this out in my own head a little bit, like thinking about, like, because I think of the world or the universe as deterministic, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like, our perspectives are dictated by our by previous situations and influences and like in a cause and effect kind of way. Mm-hmm. And then on top of it, we have limited perspective to new stimulus. And I don't know. I don't know if I'm going anywhere intelligent with this.
No, I think you're very much going. I think you're going to the heart of the issue, in my opinion.
It's just all. I mean, it's so complex and it's all so interconnected that it just seems like one cannot actually have just Marxism or just postmodernism or even just like determinism. Like, it's all so mixed together. Well,
the thing is that humans are not an objective actor. There's no chance for a human to be, and a human can be a very informed actor and be acting very close to objective, but we can't claim with 100% certainty that anything is anything, because if we disappear, why did it even matter? What was there? Right. None of that stuff is relevant. Like, we're talking to each other about how we see something that is a phenomena in a universe that gives no shits, frankly.
Right. Yeah. And ultimately we'll forget about us and this audio will disappear and nothing will,
It will be destroyed when the sun expands and then contracts many years, unless it has somehow been archived somewhere else, which may happen, but I don't know, and there's some point where I don't necessarily care, but
yeah, that's right.
But the point, I think that what you're getting at is ultimately like the most important thing to think about. There is an objective universe, there is an objective quote unquote reality, but the universe is a concept that we came up with. Objective is a concept that we came up with. Reality is a concept that we came up with. And if we would spend more time understanding that these things are ours and therefore vulnerable, I feel like we would be able to perhaps do more as a species, along the lines of maintenance, of working on things, of putting them together, you know?
Right. Instead of getting stuck in the, okay, we've solved this problem forever mentality, you can still keep that humility and keep looking for more information and more answers. And, like, I guess in a way that science kind of does and philosophy kind of does now.
I think they ultimately, like, and then here's why I think Marxism becomes so useful in that effect, is because when we start talking about science and we start talking about philosophy, there is a profit motive. There is a reason to create quote unquote science or quote unquote philosophy, the images of science or philosophy,
right,
in a commodified form, distributing it for the exchange of social and hard capital. There is absolutely a structure that you can benefit from giving the people what they want. And this is, I think, why Marxism is so important in this dynamic. We can analyze those structures If we, again, take the idea of abstract and material out of the situation and start to look at it as commodity, market, etc.
Right.
This is why I think that it's so important not to lose the Marxist elements of this. There's so much at play. I obviously believe in science. Scientific consensus is
right.
It's important to me. I've said as such many, many times. I don't as somebody who gives a crap about what postmodernism says. I am certainly a very evidence-based person to the point of my own detriment. I would even go ahead and say to regard recent events.
Yeah.
I personally, I look at the social relations that are created by, this is a neoliberal problem, but I think that it's kind of just a liberal problem. Neoliberalism being the fetishization of the market, the application of the market to as many situations as possible. My belief is that results in market norms taking over social norms. The more we have that, the more we have to understand that things will act as a market and act as transactions, and there will be competitive dynamics and there will be monopolistic dynamics that apply to things like science, things that are ostensibly intended not to be affected by the whims of any market. There are not just objective, quote unquote, markets. There are abstract markets, there are social markets, there are attention markets, so on and so forth. I've said a million times, the marketplace of ideas, attention is currency there. That's what I'm getting at with that stuff. And that's why I think that Marxism should maybe be considered by more people who are talking about postmodernism, because that gives us, if you read Capital, there is such an intense, it's not a complete analysis. There are, like I said, monopolistic dynamics that Marx probably never would have imagined, or maybe could have. I don't know. His accumulation of capital chapter gets at some of it, but things, they've gotten really messed up, I guess is the only way to really put it.
Yeah, I often attribute how messed up things are to the need for never-ending growth.
Absolutely.
That comes with the capitalist ideal, I guess.
Well, look at this thing going on with Activision Blizzard. They literally posted record profits. They've never had a better year. It was their best year on record. And they laid off 800 people, and their workforce is like 4,000 people total. It's a massive layoff.
Yeah. So then next year...
That's wild. It's absolutely... It's something that makes no sense if you believe in capitalism. Like, if you're like, capitalism is right, competition will bring us all of the best products and so on and so forth, which I don't believe, obviously, but if you do believe that, that should not make sense to you. Whereas if you apply a Marxist analysis to it, even to some degree, it stops being as surprising.
Right. And almost predictable.
Oh, yeah, I would say predictable. In fact, I would say, I've said this a few other places. I may have even said it one of the other times I've been on Brainstorm here. You can look at the video game industry for stuff that will be the norm not long after it happens there. Like, they normalize this kind of stuff.
Right.
And it may be that other companies have done something like this in the past. That's certainly, I would say that's not just possible. I'd say it's probable. But they did it in a manner that it's obvious to everyone what happened. And that makes it okay when ultimately people continue to buy their games and they continue to make money. It becomes normalized. And it's not like you can change that by not buying their games, because somebody will buy their games. They have the money to market. They have the money to disseminate propaganda that will make them money. They will continue to post record years. The years that they don't post record years will be years that they have done something that they're aware of will not give them a record year.
Yeah.
Markets don't work supply and demand. That's the thing.
No.
They work in a manner that is very directed, and people don't understand that.
Yeah. I always relate like the stuff back to my own job, the industry I work in. And up until I think it was 2014 or 2015, somewhere in there, we had a huge oil boom here in my area. And so people were spending money like crazy and they were racking up record profits every year. And then the price of oil went down. Well, they didn't just take that hit to their profits. They already had profits in mind the whole time. They were never going to cut back on their winnings, as it were. Mm-hmm. Instead, they cut staff. They cut jobs. They cut like...
this sounds familiar.
So I'm thinking of Activision and Blizzard, and I'm thinking, okay, so they're expecting less income perhaps next year, or they're expecting more income, but they need more profits.
Yeah, I mean, they're just adjusting.
Yeah.
They know what they want, and they know how to get there, and so they cut everybody who's in the way of that. Like, the whole microtransaction economy has led to just a massive boom for all of these companies. And it's because, again, these are small things. They're little things that people have been been given incentives to accept as normal. And that's exactly how everything continues to work. If you're talking about a supply and demand, no one is demanding microtransactions. No one is demanding that games that cost $60 contain microtransactions. No one's demanding any of that. They're not supplying something people are demanding. They're supplying a business model that they know that they can get away with if they normalize it.
Yeah, and then they sell it to you through advertising and whatnot, and games.
Yeah, I mean, it's present, and they give you a game that's like maybe actually a good game. Like, I don't hate Star Wars Battlefront 2.
Right.
That was a big controversy because of the way that loot boxes were. And it ended up not necessarily working out in the way they wanted it to work out. I'm sure they wanted to get out of that with loot boxes completely normalized. But, I mean, I don't look at that game like, well, it doesn't play fun because of loot boxes. I look at it as this game is a massive inconvenience because of loot boxes. And what they do is they just continue to erode that. I mean, another product will come out that contains loot boxes, and it will also be decent. And just over time, it gets eroded. It's propaganda. It's a lot of different forms of propaganda.
Yeah, I actually remember the first time I heard about downloadable content or stuff like where you can't access this part of the game unless you're paying for it.
Yeah.
And it blew my mind. I could not believe that was a thing. Well, and now it's just normal.
Yeah, considering you're talking about like a $60, you're not talking like a thing that you pay like $8 for to go into a theater and see. You're not like talking about buying a $14 DVD. You're talking about buying something for $60, and then they're like, well, part of it is cordoned off unless you give us more money. It's like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, what?
Yeah.
But like, that's normal now. Like, that sounds like a weird thing for me to criticize, even coming out of my own mouth.
Right. That's just that's games now.
Yeah. It's games 5 years ago.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's wild. It's really wild. Honestly.
So how do we get this back to postmodernism and Marxism?
Well, I mean,
guess this is still all Marxist kind of analysis in a sense.
Well, if we want to pivot specifically here to postmodernism,
sure.
What has been used in order to avoid all of this critique? People's perspective. They've been atomized. They've been shown, the thing that's wrong with video games is that people don't want you to have your big bouncy titties. Like that's what the problem is, guys. Like, and I'm not saying postmodernism is pushing a specific perspective or anything like that, but you can certainly use a postmodern critique, a deconstructive critique specifically, I would say, to reduce those types of viewpoints down to this probably didn't come just from some people. This probably came from marketing people. This probably came from people with an agenda. Where they seeded this narrative, I don't know, and frankly, I don't care. They took advantage of previous issues. There is a problem with misogyny, but that's not a problem that's exclusive to gaming. It's a problem that has been foisted as somehow exclusively to gaming, but there is a problem with misogyny in the world. There's a problem with... name 3 or 4 different things. There's a problem with gender representation in video games. Like if you even just want to stick to the binary genders, that's a big problem in video games, but also in everything. If you want to then start talking about like what exactly those things mean, it's because they're currently, or maybe less so than 10, 20 years ago, but currently still appropriate groups to use to offload the problems that would probably be very difficult to deal with if everybody was taking a Marxist critique of them. You can then use a person's perspective, especially an atomized perspective, if a person has been reduced very much to an individual who is not sharing their experience. The Spectacle, for instance, the 2-word description is separation perfected. The pure atomization of people's perspective and the simultaneous kind of you're a fool and you're a genius that everybody is marketed to in certain ways. You don't know how to solve this, but at the same time, we love you because you're smart. We constantly get those conflicting messages in so much of our world. And postmodernism, I think, if we take various critiques of, again, Baudrillard or probably Derrida more so in this area, we can take these things apart and sort of see, well, like, this is definitely directing us in this direction, where this is definitely, and this is a very basic explanation of what we could do, but like, we aren't talking about this, so we need, I think, the basic explanation. We need to have these paths that actually show us who is doing what. And if we're just like, well, capital is doing it, sure, yeah, that's true. That's definitely actually 100% true. It is capital that is doing this. But you can't say that to your neighbor. If you say that to your neighbor is going to be like, what the fuck are you talking about? Yeah, I'm mowing my lawn, leave me alone.
Yeah.
Like, we need to have ways to relate this to all of the different people of the world with their differing perspectives. And that's not something that Marxists are typically give a shit about.
Right.
And I'm not even talking like people who are like derisive towards postmodernism. Marxists, like hard Marxists, and which I would say I'd subscribe to a fairly hard Marxist analysis of capitalism. Other people who are just a little bit more orthodox than myself, and that is an understatement, but those people have come at me with like, you shouldn't care about this person's perspective or how this identity might be interacting with capitalism or blankety blank. And yes, true, there is a fetishization of identity and a fetishization of representation that ultimately is like, you need to act a certain way so that you can be accepted by the power structure. Yes, that exists, but that doesn't mean, to go with the, I think, most obvious one, that doesn't mean a black person interacts with the material conditions of capitalism in the same way that a white person does. And if I talk to them in the same way that a white person, if I just act like the problems of the white man are also their problems, that is a lie to their face, and they know it.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I've never understood about how, I guess, brocialists, socialists that don't don't like identity politics at all. Mm-hmm. Like, and I get to some extent that we're all ruled by capital and we all have to have kind of a class consciousness, and but
we desperately, in fact, I would even go as far to say as we desperately need a class consciousness,
right?
And that needs to include black working class people,
right? And
that has to include trans working class people. But these people don't interact just with class. Like, they have been designated, they've been designated groups that are okay to direct certain types of ire towards, and therefore they receive a different kind of treatment. They ultimately act as justifications for a lot of what is ultimately a class problem. Like, that's the issue, is that identity politics is the political concern of identity. You can call the civil rights movement identity politics if you are being purist about what identity politics is. But what we have, the image of identity politics today, is not that. Like, identity politics, as is discussed today by Marxists, by reactionaries, in a lot of cases, is what I would call a fetishization of identity. And they are criticizing something that is not taking black people or trans people or gay people or any group seriously. They are criticizing something that they themselves could understand very easily with a word called it's recuperation. It's the idea that capital will subsume a version of everything that can serve capital. Yeah. And that's what, in my opinion, reactionaries and Marxists alike are criticizing when they say identity politics is bad. It is not. I think a lot of reactionaries think they're not acting with any sort of racism, and I think that Marxists really think they're not acting with any sort of racism. But ultimately, they are not acknowledging part of the system which specifically directs that's like more problems to certain people based on identity. And it does this, in my opinion, for the same reason why we export labor to other countries, is because those people are easier to get away with harming. It's just that simple, because we create a separate experience for those people where those people have stuff that's just not relatable to the average white person. Even a poor white person can understand what a poor black person goes to up to a certain point. But like, when I explain how people have treated me on social media over the last 10 years, the video I just put out, Peter Coffin's Fake Girlfriend Rides Again,
good video.
I appreciate
really
that. I didn't explain the full extent. I tried to generalize my experience in a lot of ways, because I know that getting into the weeds makes it unrelatable. People can't understand what that experience has been because they haven't been through 10 years of that. It's that simple. And you haven't been through, and I understand these are definitely not the same thing, but it's the absence of understanding a perspective is very important to understand when relating to when a white working class person is talking to a black working class person. Again, maybe they can understand literally 90% of their experience, but there's a certain element of that that person has lived every day of their life that is different.
Yeah, which is which creates a different perspective. So then
and we have to, when we're building class consciousness, have to be able to understand that that perspective is A, valid, B, important, and can be related back to class if we care to. But if we don't care to, what we're going to end up doing is alienating these people. And here's the other thing, like, it can be related back to class, but related doesn't mean it is exactly the same thing as class. Right. There's a sort of other type of class here in that is more designated than it is brought by the relations of capital. It's a designated sort of punching bag class. Right. And that's what identity is. And that's not something that you can just specifically account for by saying people own the means of production or they don't.
Right. You have to acknowledge these other types of class and these other identities in order to make it so that those people can participate equally in owning the means of production.
Exactly. And the other thing is, like, if we're talking about, say, how things are in capitalism, and then we're also talking about abolishing capitalism, we have to understand these are also two different things. There are a lot of people who, like, they will be completely derisive towards the idea of, I know you're from Canada and you have a much better healthcare system, but moving the United States to Medicare for all is not enacting socialism in the United States. As much as as much as it would be good, it is not the overall goal. Right. Would it help us in sort of converting people to the idea that democratic ownership and control over the means of production would be good? It will help us, but it is not changing over to socialism. And for some people, that means it's an obstacle and must be attacked. Like, you will see people do that with Medicare for all. You'll see people do that with just the Green New Deal thing in general. I've seen a lot of that. And it's like, no, I understand that this is not socialism. I also really don't think that if we can't even agree on like a sort of ceasefire between postmodernism and Marxism, I don't think that we're ready necessarily to organize like with each other, because that's ultimately the thing that we have to do in order to switch over to something that is not capitalism. I would prefer a more libertarian oriented socialism, but it's also not up to me. It's a lot of people, and ultimately organization is going to be the thing that determines that stuff. And we're not going to get there if we can't stop fighting over goofy stuff.
Right. And frankly, I mean, isn't part of the point of not giving people health care? I mean, not intentionally by some conspiratory oversight or whatever, but people not having health care means they have to participate in capitalism in a more desperate way, and they can't organize. So, I mean, if they have universal health care, then that's one step closer to the goal, right? It
is one thing that is out of the way. Like, in my opinion, when Trump is gone, what if that ends up being the way things go? I don't want to make assumptions. I'm not one to do that. I was telling people there's a real danger that Trump will win from the day after his announcement. Like, I said that. There were a number of people that said that. But that's... I really, really hoped to be wrong about that, and I didn't treat that as like, this is my stance on it. I try not to act as though I know the future. So, but I want to say, like, with Trump gone, that's one big thing. Is it every big thing? No. Is it the goal as the Democrats want it to be? As soon as Trump is gone, everything is okay again in their eyes. But
right.
That doesn't mean I don't want him gone. I hope Bernie Sanders runs, and I hope Bernie Sanders wins. Is he a pure socialist? No, not at all. He calls himself a democratic socialist, though, and that allows me to say, well, a democratic socialist, even if not on paper exactly what Bernie Sanders is someone who cares about the means of production being controlled democratically. Now, their idea is to move towards that through electoral means. And I don't know if I necessarily entirely agree with that, but here's what I do think. Blankety blank. And then I can talk to, like, there's that conversation can happen. That conversation couldn't happen 5 years ago.
No, that's right.
When when Bernie Sanders announced, I am philosophically obviously a lot closer to, like, I would say that, to go back a little bit further, when the public option was left out of the Affordable Care Act here, that's basically when I was like, okay, so fuck the Democrats. And that's basically when I started moving the other way. But I also, at the same time, became more cynical and was just like, whatever. What I think is irrelevant, we just need to try to have the best thing. Scam likely. What I think is irrelevant, can you edit that out? That was my phone. Yeah, for sure. What was I saying?
I don't know. I was just listening, and
right.
When Bernie Sanders, when Medicare or Universal Medicare for All was taken out of the Obamacare.
Okay, I thought very cynically about the actual system and just kind of thought, well, we got to do whatever is best. But at the same time, I also thought if I could do something about this, I would end everything. Like, what we are doing it's never going to get us anywhere. Climate change is getting worse. And that was my viewpoint up until 2015 when Bernie Sanders announced. When Bernie Sanders announced, I said, I don't think that he has a chance. I think it'll probably be Hillary Clinton, and maybe she can win. And my wife said to me, well, there's a reason why that's the only option. And it's because nobody is saying that we can go further than that. And I was like, fuck.
Right.
Well, I've wasted a lot of time.
Yeah. Shit, eh?
And that's basically, I took a pretty hard pivot towards, I supported Bernie Sanders in that election. I supported trying to get people to understand, like, hey, social democracy definitely would be good, but we also definitely have to talk about what goes beyond there. And, you know, I have people who still say to me, like, no, I thought you were a social democrat. I was like, no, I'm not a fucking social democrat. I would prefer
Bernie.
that to what we have now, but, like, the thing I want to talk about is ownership of the means of production. And I think in order to do that with everyone, as opposed to just some X class that capitalism has created for us, like let's say the white working class, that is something that capitalism has created for us. That's something we're discussing that is fully their framework on their terms, and it's a problem because I see Marxists accept that framework. I have seen more than a few Marxists say the words white working class, and that doesn't help.
No,
that's the kind of identity politics that they claim they don't accept. It is the flip side of it, but it is absolutely like they're trying to act as though like the white working class is at odds with people of other identities, and those other people of other identities need to stop talking about identities. But like, okay, so we're saying white working class now, though. So you're talking about identity. So why are you doing that? Like, you don't like that. You said you don't like that anyway. So I think that's why we do need to look at these things at least somewhat through a postmodern lens. And again, I mentioned very early in this the idea of metamodernism, which is sort of an oscillation between the two, or an occupancy of both at once.
I think I like that.
It's my opinion that's just it's the way I've seen it described by people who don't use terminology is the millennial affect.
Okay.
Like millennials, we don't not believe in science, but we are skeptical of things. And I think that attitude towards science needs to be understood as not just an attitude towards science. We're a lot like that with everything. I'm skeptical of a universal narrative, a narrative that claims this is how things are. Does that mean I think that outside of human perspective, there is no objective, quote unquote, reality? And I should say, quote unquote, unobjective as well.
Right.
No, I think there absolutely is just an unknowing, unseeing, unfeeling conglomeration of systems that have nothing to do with us. But the thing is what we see, what we talk about, and how we apply things does have something to do with us. And that's what we need to get. And I think that taking the more understanding that we need to share experiences, and we need to share narratives, and we need to corroborate, and we need to collaborate on all of these types of things, that is, it's an acknowledgement of our own limitations. And that's, in my opinion, the real solution. The acknowledgement of our limitations and the collaboration of sort of finding the closest thing, the best guess as to what objective reality is, and sharing that, sharing in the process, sharing in the answer, sharing the evidence, taking people's accounts into account. I don't think that we shouldn't be trying to move towards an evidence-based viewpoint that is accepted as a consensus. I think that's actually more important than ever because we haven't been doing it. We have not been doing it. And it's not because of postmodernism. It's because of again, massive interests that you can analyze with a Marxist perspective. And that's, it's both. Like, if we don't talk about things as both, like sarcasm and irony, in my opinion, are not, they're not polar opposites. There's something that you can be both at once. This is the same.
Yeah. I like that.
You have to. And the fact that metamodernism, again, can't be simply explained like postmodernism either. That's, again, a very big simplification of it.
Right.
Metamodernism is an affect or a sensibility. It's not like this is the thing that it is and you should follow this, because those things don't exist. Like, Marxism is an analysis. It is a single person's ideas on a set of systems and the way they interact. And I think that under scrutiny, a lot of it holds up. Some of it doesn't.
Right.
But
yeah, that seems to be like one of the things that I've encountered, and I mean, not by a ton of people, but like almost like you've said, like fetishization,
yes.
A cult of personality for Marx, and like he can do no wrong, and all his statements were 100% true, and most of them probably are.
Most of them are pretty much like. And also, he was criticizing a different stage of capitalism too. And I'm not a Leninist by any stretch, but Lenin, right. His work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, is a lot more applicable to today than Marx's analysis of supply and demand capitalism, of industrial capitalism.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that parts of both of those things are not applicable, because they absolutely are. And again, like in these sort of mini social markets that we've created, like Twitter or Facebook or name thing, Marx's competitive dynamics and his full analysis of accumulation of capital can be applied literally to the social dynamic, because it's been marketized. These things have been made transactional. And that's, in my opinion, something that I just don't. Okay, so I've seen some minor discussion of this, and I saw their Pierre. What was his last name? Somebody brought this guy to my attention recently, and he wrote an essay called "Types of Capital," and it is bang on with this kind of stuff, but it's not widely discussed.
Shut up.
It's I mean, there is a social capital, and that social capital is only applicable in certain, like, you can atomize it further than that. Like, so there's social justice capital, there is reactionary capital, there is, and these are subsets of a social capital. You can use it in this market, but you can't use it in this market. You would have to figure out some way to convert it over to that market, which is possible. And all of these types of capital can also then be converted into hard capital in the form of currency. You can end a thread with your PayPal for people to donate. You can end a thread with your Patreon for people to become a subscriber to your like, these things are all elements of capitalism manifesting themselves in our social world. And we need to understand that, like, we have social classes that mirror economic classes, and we also, these things interact with each other differently. We have perspectives to consider. We have stuff to deconstruct. We have it's massively complex, and I am sure that while I may have provided some direction during the course of this, I probably haven't provided any answers, and ultimately I don't think that we can have answers unless we start applying these frameworks in a manner that, like, when I look at something, I think, well, what's the Marxist analysis here? Well, and then when I sort of come up with, this is the dynamic I think is at play here as far as who has power and who doesn't, then I start to try to bring in the ideas of different perspectives. And I start to deconstruct, like, okay, so if we split this into these elements, what's the fundamental purpose of this element? What's the fundamental purpose of this element? And I don't understand why we're not doing that. So like there's stuff that's valuable from all of these people, and no one person has ever been right about everything.
Well, yeah, and that's just it. But it's hard, right? It takes work.
Yeah, that's the thing. I ended that fake girlfriend video on that. There are a lot of people who will very happily put themselves into a situation where they seem right, and that's that. They feel like they've been validated, they've been given what says their viewpoint going in was correct, and that's enough for them. But it's not enough for me. It's just not.
Yeah. It's, and I think that, I mean, not to get too moralizing about it, but I think that often that easy way, that's that's where trouble lies. Like,
well, the easy way is, if you can, here's where the Marxism comes back in. The easy way is commodifiable as the alternative to the hard way, and therefore capital can use the easy way to their benefit.
They can sell it to you.
And this is why I tend not to place it in a moralizing thing. I think that it's important to highlight this dynamic, but it's also important to show it as capitalism, as an abstract system, funneling you towards something that benefits it or just doesn't hurt it, rather than something that will hurt it. That is it's coercive too, because if you don't follow that, you are often put in a position where people hate you. Like, you're represented as the bad guy. You're represented as a problem. You're a troublemaker, a person who's stirring shit. And I think I know that a little too well.
Right. Yeah.
So that, I mean, that's kind of, in my opinion, the thing that has led me into to be the image of the problem personally, but not actually being the problem. People are alienated. People are hurt. People are traumatized. There's a whole lot of pain in the world. And capital has incentivized going after a thing that you sort of objectify those negative feelings into. And if you can destroy that thing, in this case, it can be a person, it can be a viewpoint. Marxists, again, will do this with postmodernism. Postmodernists, even though I wouldn't really characterize anyone as a postmodernist who's being serious about it,
right.
Would characterize Marxists as that same thing, Marxism or Marxists or a specific Marxist. And if you can destroy that person or that group of people or that subset of ideology or that historical figure, if you can destroy that, then things are good for you. You are fine. That was the problem for you. And that's ultimately really something that you can't come to by just saying, like, well, let's analyze things by Marx, or, well, let's analyze things by Derrida, or, well, there's no one person. Like, great man theory is nonsense, in my opinion. It's just, that's not how things work. And context is how things work. And getting as much context as possible is important. And I'm sure that there's people who will listen to this and say, well, what he's saying is closer to postmodernism, or, well, what he's saying is closer to Marxism. And that's not true. Because I would characterize myself personally as probably a little closer to Marxism, but talk to a Marxist about that, and they would not.
Right.
It's a matter of perspective.
Yeah, go figure, eh? I think that's a good place to end this portion. Do you have, say, 30 extra minutes for some bonus content?
Sure, yeah.
If you like what we're doing and want to help us keep the lights on, go become a patron at patreon.com/Brainstorm Podcast. You can hear the bonus half hour that we record every episode and get a shout out when you support the show. Become a patron for just $1 an episode at patreon.com/Brainstorm Podcast. Or you can support the show by ordering a t-shirt, mug or other gear from our store at caffeepress.ca/Brainstorm Podcast Gear. If you can't afford to become a patron or buy gear, then why not give us a rating or write a review on iTunes or Stitcher? Every rating makes it easier for people to find us. Thanks for your support.
Okay, so that's it for my conversation with Peter. I hope you enjoyed it, and you can find Peter's content on YouTube by searching for Peter Coffin, or you can go to their website, petercoffin.com. I'll add a couple links in the show notes so that it's easy to find. For patrons, there's another 50 minutes of conversation that I had with Peter. We focused a lot on some things that were going on in the YouTube leftosphere and some of Peter's reactions to those things. It was kind of just more great conversation, and I hope that folks who want to hear it enough will go and become a patron for $1 an episode. Besides that, I want to mention that I know I haven't been keeping up with things the last while. I haven't been doing any writing or any vlogs or cutting up episodes to put on YouTube very quickly. And I'm just going to say, like, I don't usually talk about personal stuff too much, but I'm in the middle of a breakup with my partner of 5 years, and I've been a little depressed and a little unable to focus. So things are falling behind, and but I'm starting to get back to normal. I'm seeing a therapist that I really like, and I'm hoping that I'll be back to my normal self in no time. I've talked vaguely in the past about my cost of living going up and possibly hampering my ability to do the show, and that's because I have to find a new place for me and my son to live, and my job also cut out our overtime, and our benefits went down, and after my division was sold to a new company, so I have to calculate all that into my monthly expenditures. But I also have come up with a few ideas about cutting the costs for the show, and that will help make it more sustainable. I really appreciate all of our patrons, but I want to give a special thanks to Driffa, who went from pledging $1 per episode to $2 per episode. It really means a lot to me that anyone thinks that this podcast is worth giving money to, and it really means a lot when people increase their contribution. So with that, all of that out of the way, I want to thank our top patrons: Rob Geiger, Richard Lounsbury, Daryl Goosen, Aaron Young, Destin Doesn't Suck That Much, and of course our top patron, the Flying Spaghetti Monster, sauce be upon him. Being a top patron means signing up at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast and giving us $5 per episode or more. I was looking on iTunes, and in the US store we have 10 ratings but only 7 reviews, and in the Canadian store we have 11 ratings and 9 reviews. And in every other store I checked, we have 0 ratings and 0 reviews. And it would be super cool if you went into the iTunes store of your area and gave us 5 stars and wrote a review for us to read on the show. It would also be great if we could get a bunch of people to rate and review us on Podchaser and Podknife. I always include links to those in the show notes on our website, so they should be easy to get to, and I would really appreciate it. We also have the guys from Cognitive Dissonance coming on our show for the next live show on April 12th. That's 3 days after my birthday, and we will be playing a song from Dave's new project, Femme Fragile, during the break. So you should definitely join us on Friday, April 12th at 8:30 p.m. Mountain Time on brainstormradio.net, and check those out. Listen to the new song, listen to the interview with Cognitive Dissonance. It's going to be fun. For all the things, you can check out the show notes on our website, brainstormblog.net, and on our hosting page, thebrainstormpodcast.com. Thanks to our financial supporters, Aaron, Bob, Glenn. By reading this aloud, I agree to give Freethinker215 a free blowjob. That's not contractually accurate, I don't think. Thanks to Daryl, Destin Doesn't Suck That Much, Driffa, the Flying Spaghetti Monster sauce be upon him, Jesse, Kayla, Kim, Keith, Larry, Magnus, Richard, Rob, Stephanie, the Utah Outcasts, Podunk Polymath, and Zach. If you want to join them and help the show grow, then you can do that at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast. Or you can do a one-time donation at paypal.me/brainstormpodcast. And if you want Brainstorm gear, then check it out at tpublic.com/stores/brainstorm-podcast-gear. As I said before, all those links are also in the show notes. I want to give a special thanks to Peter for joining me to talk about postmodernism and Marxism. We had set this interview up back in December, but then life stuff started happening and I needed to deal with it, and eventually we recorded it in February, and it's just now getting put out. I apologize for taking so long with it. Thanks to Dave for our intro music. Thanks to Aaron Rabbi from Embrace the Void for doing the voiceover for our intro. You can find his stuff at voidpod.com. Thanks to Alex Capper-Murdoch for doing the voiceover for our ads, and thanks to Jason Camo for our outro music. You can find his stuff at aloststateofmind.com. All music played is either with permission or under the SOCAN license to play. For more information on SOCAN, you can check out the music license info page on our website, brainstormblog.net. Remember to give us a rating, a thumbs up, or a fave on your podcatcher of choice. Join our Facebook group, like our page, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our subreddit, sign up for our newsletter, share the show, and spread the word. The more you share, comment, and like our stuff, the more it helps the show grow. Thanks for listening, and remember, the truth matters, even if we don't have full access to it on our own.